Life was simple. Late-night gaming marathons, instant ramen for dinner, and no unexpected drama. That's how it was until the doorbell rang. Standing there was a 6-year-old with a glare sharp enough to pierce steel, demanding to be let in. Before I could figure out why a random kid was bossing me around, she dropped the bombshell, "I'm your wife." Wait, what? Now I'm spiraling, questioning everything. Did I somehow wake up in a parallel universe? Is this an elaborate prank? Or worst of all, is this her way of getting back at me for forgetting our anniversary? Whatever it is, my normal life just went straight out the window. Story begins. Don't forget to check out our YouTube channel. Like, share, and subscribe to join our channel's journey. Chapter 1. Honey, you shrunk yourself. It was supposed to be a normal day for me, a 32-year-old office worker who thrived on late-night gaming marathons and instant ramen. My wife, Hannah, the no-nonsense, borderline terrifying CEO of a tech company, had left that morning with a distracted mumble about some groundbreaking experiment happening at her lab. It was the kind of vague statement that could mean anything, likely involving lasers, wires, and a whole lot of things I'd never understand. So naturally, I did what any responsible husband would do. I went back to my ramen, fired up a new game, and tried to forget the fact that I hadn't even remembered to buy her a birthday gift yet. Hey, in my defense, she had all the gadgets, and I could barely figure out how to turn on the TV half the time. By the time the evening rolled around, and Hannah still hadn't come home, I was mildly concerned. She was never late. A quick check on my phone confirmed she hadn't texted either. I called her lab, only to be informed that her experiment was still underway. Great. Now I had visions of her trapped in some lab, surrounded by malfunctioning machinery, and her usual deadly glare. I mentally prepared myself to bail her out of whatever science experiment gone wrong she was in. Then the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I did what any sane person would do. I froze in place, and considered pretending I wasn't home. But curiosity won over and I shuffled to the door. When I opened it, I was greeted by a sight that will forever haunt my soul. Standing on my doorstep, holding a briefcase roughly twice her size, was a 6-year-old version of Hannah. She had the same sharp eyes, the same no-nonsense posture, but now, with a tiny frame, it looked absolutely ridiculous. Her suit jacket hung on her like a tarp, and she looked like she was one misplaced step away from tripping over her briefcase. And yet she crossed her arms and glared up at me with the exact same intensity she used when firing an employee. "Are you just going to stand there, or are you going to let me in?" she snapped. I blinked a few times, making sure I wasn't seeing things. Maybe I was just too deep into my gaming zone, and had started hallucinating. But no, she was definitely real, and definitely 6. Kid, are you lost?" I asked, trying to figure out the appropriate response to this absolutely unreal situation. Kid, she repeated, her voice filled with outrage. "It's me, Hannah, your wife." I stared at her in complete horror. I couldn't wrap my head around it. This was impossible. This was not happening. I took a shaky step backward. Oh my God, this isn't because I forgot our anniversary again, is it? Hannah, who was 6 now, apparently sighed dramatically, like she'd had this conversation 100 times already. "Do you seriously think I'd use a groundbreaking experiment to punish you for forgetting our anniversary? Seriously, mean you? I've got standards. I mean, I wouldn't put it past you," I muttered. But she didn't hear me because she was already pushing past me into the hallway. As I closed the door, I still couldn't quite process what was happening. My mind was racing. How did this happen? Was she always like this? Did she have some evil plan to turn me into a kid? Was this a nightmare I hadn't woken up from? I followed her into the living room, where she promptly climbed onto the couch, kicked her legs up, and gave me a look that could only be described as CEO-level disapproval. "So now what?" I asked, rubbing my temples. "Now," Hannah said, "you need to find out how to get me back to normal. I've got a lot of things to do, and I can't do them with this body." She gestured at herself with a look of utter disgust. Right, the whole turning back to normal thing. I scratched my head. Okay, first, let's start with your lab. Can they fix this?" "Oh, you bet they can," Hannah said with a tone that suggested everything was under control. And that's how my night, which had started with ramen and gaming, turned into babysitting a tiny, furious version of my wife who was now stuck in the body of a child. One that was much harder to argue with. Chapter 2. The Wife-Child Dilemma. After an incredibly awkward explanation, which mostly involved Hannah dramatically recounting her scientific breakthrough, and me attempting to ignore the mental image of her tiny body inside a lab full of exploding machinery, I realized that my terrifyingly competent wife was now, in fact, a tiny child. "This can't be real," I muttered, pacing around the living room in circles like a confused hamster. It was the only thing that felt appropriate. My brain simply couldn't process this. I kept looking at child Hannah sitting on the couch with her little legs dangling off the edge, and her arms crossed like she was some pint-sized CEO. "It's real," Hannah snapped, kicking her legs back and forth like she owned the place. "Do you think I wanted to look like this? Do you know how hard it was to drive home like this? I could barely see over the steering wheel." I blinked at her. "You drove." She shot me a withering look. "What else was I supposed to do? Walk? My legs are half their usual length." You think I could have taken the bus in the state? Please, I had to be strategic about it. And it wasn't easy, okay, I had to sit on a pillow just to reach the pedals. I stared at her, jaw slack. So wait, you actually drove in the state? You're telling me, in all your genius, you thought it was a good idea to drive a car when you're basically the size of a 5-year-old? Hannah crossed her arms and looked away, avoiding my gaze. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds stupid. I leaned against the wall, feeling my brain slowly start to shut down. Okay, I'm just trying to understand this. This is not normal. None of this is normal. I've got a 6-year-old version of my wife sitting on my couch who apparently drove herself here in a pillow-powered vehicle. I don't know how to handle this. Oh, trust me, I don't know how to handle this either, Hannah said with a dramatic sigh. Do you think I wanted to be a child again? I had everything under control. I had a whole plan, and now look at me. I can't even reach the kitchen counter without climbing onto a chair. I'm not used to this wasteland of a body. And forget about reaching my own coffee mug. It's a nightmare. I rubbed my temples. Okay, deep breaths. This is fine, I can handle this. We just need to get me back to my adult self. Hannah finished for me, sounding far too calm about the whole situation. Yes, that's the general idea, but here's the fun twist. The machine I used to de-age myself, kind of, well, exploded. I blinked again. It exploded. She nodded solemnly, as though she were discussing something much more serious like the demise of a beloved pet. Yes, mean you, the machine exploded? Like a big explosion? The kind where you can't go back to just pushing a button and reversing the process. I would have called you to come get me, but I couldn't even figure out how to text you. My fingers are too small for the screen. I fell onto the couch next to her, hands clutching my head. Of course, it exploded. Of course it did. Why wouldn't it? Hannah threw her head back and groaned dramatically. If you say of course it did one more time, I'm going to kick you. I stared at her. You know what? You're right. Of course it exploded. That makes perfect sense. You've gone full child. I'm apparently in a bad comedy sketch, and now we are both just trying to survive this nightmare. Oh, and to make it even better, you can't even work the phone now. What's next, Hannah? Should I start feeding you pureed food? Hannah shot me a sharp look. If you want to keep all your fingers, I'd suggest not saying that again. Right, I said, holding up my hands in mock surrender. Okay, no feeding you mashed potatoes. Got it. But seriously, we've got to fix this. Surely, your lab can. She hesitated, then looked down at her tiny hands. Well, about that, they need like a week to rebuild the machine. And even then, they don't know if it'll work the same way. There's some minor issues with the system, you know, explosions and all. I groaned, sinking back into the couch. Oh great, a week. A week, Hannah. You're telling me you're going to be 6 for a week. How am I supposed to deal with that? Hannah raised an eyebrow. Oh, I don't know. Maybe don't treat me like a small child who needs her diaper changed. I'm still a highly intelligent adult, mean you? I can contribute to society? I looked at her incredulous. Oh really? And what's your first order of business? Giving a TED talk on how to survive explosions and bad science experiments. Hannah's eyes lit up. Actually, that sounds like a good idea. No, Hannah. No TED talks. No more science experiments. No more explosions. She gave me a smirk that made me regret those words instantly. We'll see. I might just run for office while I'm at it. I slapped my palm to my forehead. This is going to be the worst week of my life, isn't it? Probably, Hannah said, popping a leg up onto the coffee table. But look on the bright side. You'll be able to tell people that you have a 6-year-old version of your wife to take care of. That should be fun. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. In the end, I just sat there, silently praying for a miracle. Or, you know, for Hannah to stop coming up with ideas that could make this way worse. Chapter 3. Visit from a neighbor. Since Hannah's lab team needed at least a week to rebuild the machine, I was officially on Hannah child care duty. The first logical step was to keep her hidden at home, away from the outside world, and any potential questions. But there was a tiny problem with that plan. Hannah, despite being in the body of a 6-year-old, had all the patience of a caffeinated squirrel. I can't just sit around here doing nothing, she declared, kicking her legs at a ridiculous pace while perched on the couch, clearly bored out of her mind. I shot her a look that only deepened my headache. You're literally a child right now, I pointed out, feeling the logic in my words slowly crumble. What do you expect to do? Go to a board meeting? Hannah, however, wasn't done with her delusional ideas. Why not? I'm still smarter than everyone there. I could probably manage the whole company better than your colleagues. They don't even know what a VPN is. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or simply go lay down in traffic. Hannah, you're 6. You can barely reach the cereal shelf. I'm 6 in body, not in brain, mean you. She huffed, folding her arms. There's a difference. I can still run a multinational corporation. I mean, look at me. I'm practically a prodigy. Before I could even respond, the doorbell rang, interrupting my escalating panic attack. Oh, great. This was it. My life was already spiraling into chaos. And now I was going to have to explain why my wife had somehow turned into a tiny CEO. I opened the door, and there stood Mrs. Park, our overly friendly neighbor who had no concept of personal space, and unnerving need to know everyone's business? Oh, I mean you? she beamed, giving me one of her signature smiles that could brighten up a funeral. Then her eyes landed on Hannah, who was still sitting on the couch, looking like a tiny version of herself, only now wearing a frown, and a suit jacket that was way too big. Mrs. Park's eyes widened. "Who's this adorable little girl?" she asked, clearly charmed. I froze. I stammered, the gears in my brain grinding to a halt. What did I say to that? This is my niece, Hannah interrupted, cutting me off with a grin that looked completely fake but probably passed for a 6-year-old's charm. She shot me a wink as if to say, "I've got this. I'm visiting for a while." I could feel the blood drain from my face as I fought the urge to bury myself under the nearest couch cushion. "Niece," I repeated, nodding numbly, like a sleep-deprived fool. "Oh, how precious," Mrs. Park gushed, stepping forward and getting a bit too close for comfort. "She looks just like your wife." My brain tried to process the horror of this, but before I could blurt out some form of a correction, Hannah's voice rang out like a trumpet. "That's because I get that a lot." Hannah cut me off with a laugh that was disturbingly natural for a 6-year-old. She then elbowed my leg, making me stumble slightly in surprise. I shot her a glare, hoping it was a glare, and not the terrified look of a man who had lost all control of his life. "What are you doing?" I hissed under my breath. "You're the one who couldn't think of a good lie," Hannah whispered back, clearly unbothered by the situation. She turned back to Mrs. Park, her professional smile in place. "I'm here for a while, just taking a break from school." Mrs. Park looked like she had won the lottery. "Oh, how lovely. And you must be so smart, dear. Just like your uncle mean you?" I choked. Yeah, smart." I gave Mrs. Park a strained smile. "Very smart. Do you want to see my homework?" Hannah piped up suddenly, her voice like the sweet chime of an ice cream truck. "It's full of math problems. I'm really good at them. I'm gonna solve the whole world's problems with numbers." Mrs. Park's face lit up. "Oh, I'd love to see it. I bet you're better at math than your uncle, aren't you?" I shot Hannah a look of panic. No. I'm much better at math, Mrs. Park. Much better. I mean, look at my adult brain." I gave a limp wave at my head like that would solve everything. Hannah, of course, wasn't having any of it. She leaned in, looking up at Mrs. Park with innocent eyes. "Well, you see, my uncle is good at math," she said sweetly, "but I think I'll catch up to him. He's getting old, you know. His brain's probably slowing down." I froze. Mrs. Park's eyes widened in mock shock. "Mean you old?" I glared at my 6-year-old wife. "Thanks for that," I muttered, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're welcome," Hannah chirped, her face breaking into an innocent smile. "I try my best to help. I was going to be the death of me." Mrs. Park smiled, and patted me on the back, oblivious to the chaos I was barely holding together. "Oh, mean you always make me laugh. You two are just the best." I just nodded. "Yep, we sure are." I made a mental note to avoid all future interactions with Mrs. Park that involved any form of responsibility. As she left, I turned to Hannah, who was already happily skipping toward the fridge, completely unfazed. "Why did you do that?" I asked, exasperated. Hannah looked over her shoulder, her eyes sparkling mischievously. "Because if I didn't, you would have said something weird like, 'Oh, she's my wife,' but tiny, and then we'd have to deal with more questions. This way, I'm just visiting." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "I don't think that made anything better, Hannah. But, okay, I guess I'll just have to learn how to handle this now. Can't believe I'm actually saying this. But maybe next time we just lie low until the machine is fixed." Hannah just shrugged. "Nah, this was fun. Let's go make cookies." I stared at her. "You want to bake? You can barely reach the counter?" Her grin grew wider. "Exactly. It's going to be hilarious." And that's how I ended up spending the rest of the afternoon trying to explain to a 6-year-old version of my wife that no, the oven is not for turning into a spaceship, and yes, you actually have to measure the ingredients. Chapter 4. The Grocery Store Incident. Life as a child was harder than Hannah expected. She had to deal with things she never thought about before, like not being able to reach the top shelf, wearing clothes that were way too big, or too small, depending on the situation, and worst of all, people not taking her seriously. It was honestly kind of hilarious to watch her trying to act like her usual terrifying CEO self, but with the stature of a 6-year-old, I should have known it was going to be bad when I decided to take her grocery shopping. I was just trying to get it done quickly, but that plan immediately spiraled out of control. "Mean I told you to buy the organic apples?" Hannah snapped, standing in the cart like a tiny dictator. She was holding onto the sides of the cart for balance like a pint-sized queen, giving me the most disappointed look I'd ever seen. If she had her CEO glasses on, I'm sure she would have been firing me on the spot. "These are organic?" I hissed, holding up the bag of apples like I was presenting an award. "It says it right there on the label." Hannah's eyes narrowed with the intensity of someone trying to solve a multi-billion-dollar equation. She peered at the label, then shot me a glare. "No, they're not. Look at the label. These apples are not organic." Do I have to do everything myself?" I was already regretting my decision. "What do you mean do everything yourself? You're literally a child." "Being a child doesn't mean I can't be a professional," she declared, crossing her arms. I could practically hear the stock market crash in her tone. "These are the wrong apples, and I'm not going to let you ruin my future health with these fake organic apples. Before I could argue, she scrambled out of the cart like she was climbing Mount Everest, her tiny legs flailing as she tried to reach the apple section. I'll just inspect them myself, she said, climbing out of the cart with an air of self-importance that only a 6-year-old pretending to be a corporate executive could have. As she reached the apples, she started rifling through the bags with the kind of precision that could only come from years of research on fruit quality. Meanwhile, I was still standing in the middle of the aisle, mortified. A concerned store clerk, who had been watching us from the aisle, suddenly walked over with a look of suspicion. "Sir," he said slowly, his eyes scanning the situation, "is this your daughter?" I froze, the panic settling in. I didn't even know how to respond. I stammered, feeling the sweat build on my forehead. Why did I think grocery shopping would be simple? Yes, she is. Hannah, who was now kneeling on the floor, intently inspecting apples like she was testing the pH balance of a toxic waste site, whipped her head around. "No," she snapped loudly, as though she were dealing with a conference room full of idiots. The clerk blinked, clearly confused, and then turned his gaze between the two of us. "Ma'am," he said, voice full of suspicion, "do you know this man?" Unfortunately, Hannah replied without missing a beat, the sass in her tone radiating like she was giving a TED talk. "He's my uncle, but he's also a little slow. So I've been helping him with his grocery choices." I wanted to vanish. I was going to die right here in this grocery store. There was no coming back from this. The clerk stared at us for a long moment, then pulled out his phone. "I'm calling security," he said, typing something into his phone. "Wait. No. I rushed to stop him, but the situation had already gone completely off the rails. "I'm not kidnapping her. I swear. She's my wife." "I'm not his wife, you idiot," Hannah interrupted, still examining apples with the precision of a detective. "I'm his niece. Keep up, old man." The clerk raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced by my increasingly bizarre explanations. "Right, well, I'll still call security to confirm," he said, shaking his head. I could feel my face turning into a tomato as I tried to figure out what to say next. But before I could think of anything, Hannah shot me a look over her shoulder. "I knew this was going to happen," she muttered. "You can't even keep track of your own lies. You're lucky I'm here to help you?" "Oh, I'm so lucky," I grumbled under my breath, feeling the weight of my failure bearing down on me. "You're an actual nightmare?" Hannah stood up, brushing herself off, and placed the apple she'd been inspecting into the cart with a flourish. "There, organic apples? Now let's move on to the non-GMO bananas. I know you're probably not even aware of those, but we can't let the poor quality of your shopping affect our lives." Before I could respond, the store clerk returned with the manager, both of them giving us skeptical looks. The manager cleared his throat. "Sir, we've received reports of suspicious behavior," and he trailed off, glancing at Hannah. "No," I said quickly, holding up both hands. "I'm not kidnapping her. I promise." "Minyu is lying," Hannah interrupted with a roll of her eyes, clearly getting bored of the whole thing. "He's an incompetent husband who doesn't know how to buy organic produce. I'm just here to make sure his grocery shopping doesn't ruin my life." Again, I groaned. This was not happening. After what felt like an eternity of interrogation, the store staff finally seemed convinced we weren't part of some weird heist operation. I was given a half-hearted apology, and as they walked away, I sank into the cart, feeling both physically and emotionally drained. Hannah jumped back in the cart and crossed her arms smugly. "See, I saved the day. Now go get some non-GMO bananas, or I swear, I'll throw a tantrum." I muttered something under my breath as I pushed the cart down the aisle, trying to avoid eye contact with any of the other shoppers. The rest of the trip was less eventful except for the part where Hannah insisted we get an entire display of baby carrots because they looked just like tiny little people, and she thought it would be cute for our future kids. By the time we finally checked out, I was pretty sure I'd aged about 10 years. I just had one question. How was I going to survive the next week with my 6-year-old wife, who was somehow a terrifying dictator in disguise? Chapter 5. Playground politics. Hannah's boredom reached new heights when she came up with the most absurd idea yet. "I'm going to infiltrate the local playground to study the youth." I stared at her, genuinely confused. "You're studying the youth? What does that even mean?" She flashed me a grin and adjusted her pigtails with all the seriousness of a corporate executive preparing for a high-stakes meeting. "Relax, I'll blend right in." My first mistake was not stopping her. The second mistake was thinking that blending in would mean something other than creating chaos. Within minutes, Hannah had taken over the playground like a tiny mafia boss, her pigtails bouncing with each exaggerated step. If there were a chair for her to sit in, she'd have immediately demanded one. But there wasn't, so she simply stood in the middle of the sandbox, hands on her hips, surveying the scene like it was a negotiation table. A toddler who looked like he was barely able to walk approached the slide. Hannah swooped in, blocking his path with a serious look on her face. "You want to use the slide?" she asked, her voice low and authoritative. "That'll cost you 2 juice boxes, buddy." The toddler stared at her, completely perplexed. 2 juice boxes. "For the slide," she repeated, her tone unyielding. The child's lower lip quivered. His mother, who had been on the swing nearby, looked up, utterly confused. "What?" I had already been yelling from the bench, but now I stood up, waving my arms. Hannah, stop extorting children, I shouted, desperate to defuse the situation. Me and you relax, she said without even looking back, her voice dripping with faux sincerity. They need to learn about supply and demand. This is how the world works. I watched in horror as Hannah continued to establish her playground empire. She set up a toll for the swings, 2 juice boxes per ride, and even began charging for sandcastle construction time. 5 blocks of sand for a minute of digging. You want to make a moat? That'll cost you extra, she said to a group of children who had no idea what was happening. A little girl with a stuffed bunny came up to Hannah, holding out a stick. Can I play with the slide? She asked hesitantly. Hannah narrowed her eyes. You got 2 juice boxes. The girl blinked, confused, and glanced over at her mother. I was pretty sure the mom was about to walk over and demand an explanation. But before she could do that, Hannah leaned in close to the little girl. Listen, she said, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I'll make you a deal. You give me your stick, and I'll let you slide for free. But no refunds if the slide is too bumpy. The girl blinked again. Okay, she said, handing over the stick like she was trading for a gold bar. I facepalmed so hard I thought I might actually bruise my palm. This was not what I had envisioned when I suggested a simple trip to the playground. By now the other parents had started noticing. One mom, who had been watching from the side, walked over cautiously, her hand on her child's shoulder. Excuse me, is this some sort of game? She asked, clearly concerned about the juice box exchange program that seemed to be taking off. I cleared my throat. It's, not a game actually, I said, approaching her. I'm sorry, my niece is, well, she's going through a little phase. The mom-eyed Hannah, who was now dictating taxes on the seesaw to a confused-looking boy. I see, she said slowly. Well, I'm not sure it's okay for her to be in charge of all of this. Hannah shot me a glance over her shoulder, still holding court. They need structure, she declared loudly to the group. It's for their own good. If you don't teach them how to negotiate early, they'll never survive in the real world. I was about to respond when I noticed the dad pushing a stroller toward the swing set. Hannah immediately zeroed in on him. You, she pointed. You want to swing your kid? That'll be 1 juice box. The dad raised an eyebrow, clearly baffled. What? 1 juice box, Hannah repeated. Or no swinging? Take it or leave it. I was this close to grabbing Hannah and making a run for it when a little girl piped up from behind us. I can pay her with this, she shouted, holding out a half-eaten granola bar. I don't want to slide anymore. Hannah's face lit up. Deal, she said, grabbing the granola bar like it was the best thing she'd ever been offered. You've got yourself a slide ticket for life. Okay, that's it, I said, marching over. We are leaving this playground. Hannah turned to face me, her pigtails bouncing as she put her hands on her hips. Why? I'm providing valuable lessons in business here. Do you know how much profit I just made? Profit? You're extorting children. Me and you, business is about making the most out of a situation, she said, giving me a knowing look. These kids are going to grow up and thank me when they're making their first million. I stared at her, speechless. My wife had just turned a playground into her personal economy, and I had no idea how to stop it. You are insane, I muttered under my breath. You should be thanking me, she said, smiling smugly. I'm teaching them the fundamentals of capitalism at a young age, and you're welcome. As we left the playground, Hannah gave a dramatic wave to the remaining kids. Remember, always negotiate your juice boxes, she shouted. I sighed, rubbing my temples. At this point, I was just hoping that someone could find a way to return my wife to her normal age before the entire neighborhood started taking her seriously. Chapter 6. PTA Nightmares? The chaos reached its peak when Mrs. Park, our overly enthusiastic neighbor, invited us to the PTA meeting. Assuming that Hannah, my 6-year-old wife, was my niece, I of course tried to politely decline, but Hannah had other ideas. She saw this as the perfect opportunity to put her skills to use. As we arrived, Mrs. Park was practically glowing with pride. Oh Minu, you had such a beautiful niece, she said, patting Hannah on the head like she was a prized poodle. Thanks, I mumbled, trying to keep my cool. She's really excited to be here. Hannah stood there, arms crossed, looking at the adults around her with a mix of disdain and interest. Let's get this over with. I've got big plans for this place. Mrs. Park led us into the meeting room where a bunch of frazzled parents were already sitting around, looking like they had been fighting over unpaid lunch bills for the last 2 hours. As soon as we walked in, the room went silent. Apparently a 6-year-old in a business suit wasn't exactly a common sight. Hannah, sweetie, why don't you sit here? Mrs. Park offered, ushering her to a chair at the table. Nope, Hannah said flatly, her tiny voice somehow carrying through the room. I'm sitting at the head of the table. She marched straight to the front and plopped down in the chair like she owned the place. I sighed, and sat in the seat next to her, trying to act like this wasn't the most awkward situation I had ever been in. As I sat down, I heard Hannah muttering under her breath. These meeting minutes are atrocious, she said, scanning the agenda like it was the most unorganized pile of garbage she'd ever laid eyes on. Who's in charge of this? I need to talk to them immediately. Hannah, you're 6, I whispered urgently, looking around to see if anyone was listening. Just color or something. But Hannah didn't listen to me. She was already furiously scribbling on the agenda, making corrections with a red pen she had borrowed from Mrs. Park's purse. The meeting officially began, and everyone seemed a bit on edge. Mrs. Park started with the treasurer's report, and I was just about to zone out when Hannah suddenly stood up, holding her red pen like a tiny weapon. "Excuse me," she interrupted, slamming the pen down on the table. "This budget is a mess. You can't just keep spending money on these tiny snacks. What about real food? You're all wasting resources." A few parents turned to each other, whispering. I could feel the tension in the room rising, but Hannah seemed completely unfazed. "I propose we reallocate the snack budget," she continued, totally ignoring the fact that the meeting wasn't even supposed to be about budgeting. "We need more protein, and fewer crackers. Also, we need better juice boxes. These are too sugary." "Hannah, sweetheart," one of the more confused moms said hesitantly. "We don't really have the power to change the snack budget. You have to learn to make the right decisions." Hannah cut her off. "You can't just let your kids run wild with sugar." She paused for dramatic effect. "And if you don't want to end up with a bunch of hyperactive toddlers, you'll listen to me." By now, several parents were taking notes, real notes, not just doodles, or thoughts about how quickly they could escape this meeting. "Hannah, please," I whispered desperately. "Can we just let them handle the budget stuff?" But Hannah was in full CEO mode now. "No," she declared, pointing to the meeting minutes. "You need a new snack schedule? You're going to meet twice a week, and you'll have more protein options: chicken nuggets, turkey sticks. If you try to feed them tofu again, I'm going to have some serious words with you." I stared at her in disbelief. She was 6. 6-year-olds shouldn't be reorganizing PTA budgets and discussing the nutritional value of chicken nuggets. But things only got worse. As Hannah made changes to the snack schedule, she also began adding items to the agenda. "We need more field trips. But not just any field trips. I'm talking about real adventure," she said, looking at the parents like she was auditioning to be a world leader. "I'm thinking space camp. It's educational, and it'll give them an edge in the future." I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Hannah, you can't just decide things like that," I said, burying my face in my hands. Hannah shot me a withering look. "Mean you, I'm a visionary," she said, as if that explained everything. "Let them dream big." At this point, the other parents were visibly uncomfortable, and I could see that a few were plotting their escape. 3 of the more timid ones, who had been mostly silent up until now, suddenly stood up, their faces pale. "You know what?" one of the dads said, standing shakily. I don't think I'm cut out for this. I'll just, email my feedback later." "Same," another mom said, grabbing her things. "I need to go check on my kids. It was nice meeting you all." And just like that, we were down 3 parents. Hannah looked around the room, and nodded approvingly. "See, I've already streamlined the team. Now we can focus on real work." I buried my face in my hands, wishing for the ground to swallow me up. By the time the meeting finally ended, Hannah had not only completely reorganized the PTA's budget, but she had also scared 3 parents into quitting, and convinced the rest to agree to her new snack schedule. As we left the meeting, Mrs. Park gave me an exhausted smile. "Mean you, your niece is quite the leader. Tell me about it," I muttered, glancing over at Hannah, who was already plotting her next move. "She's going to run this place one day?" I wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified. Probably a little bit of both. Chapter 7. Back to normal almost. After what felt like an eternity during which I went through all 5 stages of grief, Hannah's lab team finally managed to rebuild a machine that turned her into a 6-year-old. The process to reverse her condition was surprisingly simple. Too simple, in fact, considering the mess it caused last time. But I wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth. I just spent the entire time praying that nothing would go wrong again. The last time was traumatic enough. I'm pretty sure the PTA will never be the same. The moment I heard the whir of the machine starting up, my heart skipped a beat. I clutched the nearest chair as the lab's lights flickered ominously. A cloud of smoke billowed out of the machine's vents, and for a brief moment, I wondered if it was about to explode again. Maybe this was all one big prank, and I'd be stuck with a life-size baby doll for another month. But then the smoke began to clear, and the shape emerging from the haze was unmistakable. Hannah. There she was, standing tall and proud in her full adult glory, arms crossed, as intimidating as ever. She looked exactly the same minus the pigtails and bright pink overalls. "Finally," she said with a dramatic sigh, adjusting her blazer like nothing had happened. I swear that machine was more trouble than it was worth. I could have sworn I heard angels singing in the background as the weight of the world lifted off my shoulders. "You're back," I said, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Thank God. I don't think I could have handled another day of PTA meetings." Hannah raised an eyebrow, her smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. "Honestly, you were terrible at pretending to be a single uncle. I could barely watch. How did you even survive those grocery store trips?" "Hey, I was trying my best," I shot back defensively. "You don't just accidentally end up in a situation where you're trying to convince a store clerk that your wife is actually your 6-year-old daughter." Hannah snorted. "I don't know what's worse, your terrible acting skills, or the fact that you actually tried to lie about it." I rolled my eyes. Well, I figured it was better than telling everyone the truth. I already had Mrs. Park convinced I was running a daycare by the end of that week. "Speaking of daycare," Hannah said with a mischievous glint in her eye as we walked out of the lab, "I've been thinking." I froze in place. "Please, don't." You know, being a kid wasn't all bad, she continued, her voice dripping with amusement. I think I could run a daycare? I felt my stomach drop. Please don't. But Hannah wasn't listening. I mean, I've got a lot of experience now. Plus, I'm pretty sure I could take over any playgroup with just a look. These kids need some structure, they need discipline. I turned to her wide-eyed. Hannah, no, you're not starting a daycare? For the love of everything, please? You've already taken over the PTA? You do not need to conquer the preschool industry next. Hannah, clearly entertained by my panic, walked ahead of me with a smug grin. Fine, no daycare. But I'm telling you, I'd be amazing at it. Maybe I should just start a parenting class instead. I tried to think of something, anything, to distract her. How about we don't do anything that involves children for a while? Maybe, I don't know, go to a spa. Somewhere that doesn't involve power struggles and juice box extortion. Hannah raised an eyebrow and shot me a side glance. You're afraid of the children, aren't you? I'm afraid of you, Hannah, I said, trying to be serious, though the laughter in my voice betrayed me. I've been in your presence for years now, and I'm still not sure how I'm not on some sort of watch list. She chuckled and slowed her pace. Relax, I'm not going to start a daycare right now, but I am considering opening up a consulting service for overwhelmed parents. My heart sank even further. Hannah, please, no more business ventures. You've already restructured the PTA, the grocery store, and, let's not forget, the playground. She smirked. Oh, the playground. That was just the beginning. Those toddlers were so unprepared. I'm just giving them life lessons early. You can't expect kids to understand capitalism if they're not exposed to it at a young age. I buried my face in my hands. What have I done? I never should have let you get your hands on that machine. Hannah turned to me, her expression softening slightly. You know, for the record, I wasn't the one who messed everything up. It was your inability to keep me entertained. I tried. I threw my hands up in the air. I even got you a kiddie pool for the backyard. How was I supposed to know that it wouldn't be enough for you? She paused for a moment, considering. The kiddie pool was a nice thought, but it lacked vision. You should have gotten me a trampoline park. That would have kept me busy. I stared at her, utterly defeated. A trampoline park? For a 6-year-old? Exactly, she replied, as if it was the most logical thing in the world. Who else could bounce higher than a 6-year-old who runs an entire PTA? I sighed heavily. I'll never win with you, will I? Hannah grinned, her usual mischievous sparkle back in her eyes. Nope, but at least you get to live through all the chaos with me. As we walked out of the lab, back to what I assumed was normal life, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were far from done with the strange new chapter. Whatever Hannah decided to do next, I was pretty sure I'd be getting the front row seat to it, and I had no idea whether I should be thrilled or terrified. Probably both. Epilogue. The mini dictator returns. Just when I thought our lives were finally returning to some semblance of normal, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. Before I could even turn around, Hannah marched into the living room, a tiny lab coat trailing behind her and oversized goggles perched on her face. She looked like a mad scientist from a children's show, and I knew in that moment that trouble was coming. Mean you, she said, her voice filled with unshakable confidence, as if she had just discovered the secret to world peace. She held up a small vial filled with a strange green liquid, the color of something I would never trust in any situation. You're next. I froze. What? Relax, she said with a grin that was equal parts mischievous and terrifying. It's just an experiment? I could feel the blood drain from my face. Hannah, no. No more experiments. I've seen what happens when you get your hands on a little project. I've been through this, we have been through this. Do you remember when you turned into a child? Do you remember how that went? Oh, I remember, Hannah said with a wink, clearly undeterred. But this time is different. Trust me, this will be much better. Besides, look at me. I'm practically a professional now. I stared at her tiny lab coat, which looked like it belonged to a doll, and then at the large safety goggles that were slowly slipping down her nose. There was no way in hell I was going to let this happen. Not again? Absolutely not, I said, backing away slowly. But Hannah was already taking a step forward, her smile widening. Mean you, think of the possibilities. You could be even smarter than you already are. Just imagine superpowers? Superpowers, I repeated, blinking in disbelief. What kind of superpowers? The ability to become a 6-year-old? I already lived with that nightmare. She waved a hand dismissively. No, not like that. It'll be different. You won't have to wear pigtails, and no more juice box extortion. Just pure brainpower. I shook my head, suddenly filled with a mix of dread and absolute disbelief. Hannah, I've watched you destroy PTA meetings, reorganize grocery stores, and hold a literal hostage situation on the playground over who gets to use the slide. You've already conquered the children of the neighborhood. What more could you possibly want? She didn't even flinch. Control of the universe, of course, but I thought I'd start small with you. She held the vial out like it was a delicate piece of art. I'm not drinking that, I said, backing toward the door. In fact, I think I'll just... But before I could make it 2 steps, Hannah's tiny hand shot out, grabbing my sleeve with a force that surprised me. You don't even know what it does yet. How can you say no to something you haven't even tried? I can say no because it's you doing the experimenting, and the last time you said, relax, we ended up at the grocery store with you extorting juice boxes from toddlers. I said, my voice rising in panic. Hannah, you've got bigger plans than this. I'm not going to be your guinea pig for the 5th time. You underestimate me, she replied. Not giving an inch. This isn't about juice boxes, Minu. This is about changing the world. Our world? Imagine what you could do with the power of absolute genius. I shook my head furiously. I am not your test subject. Oh, come on, Minu, she said with a teasing tone. I thought you liked a little bit of adventure in your life. A little bit of unpredictability? What's the worst that could happen? I stared at the vial again, then at the grin on Hannah's face. It was the same expression she had when she got her first tech startup off the ground. The same one she wore when she successfully reorganized the PTA. It was the look of a woman who had no idea how to stop until she was in complete control. Hannah, I said, taking a deep breath. The last time you said, what's the worst that could happen? I spent a week pretending to be your single uncle. I think I've earned a little peace and quiet. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. What if I told you that after this experiment, you could have anything you want? A lifetime supply of instant ramen, unlimited late-night gaming hours? My resolve was starting to crack. Unlimited ramen. That was dangerously close to a deal-breaker. I swallowed, but then, remembering the chaos I'd survived with her in charge of the Universaka, the neighborhood playground, I steeled myself. No, I said firmly. You're not turning me into a mini dictator, Hannah. I'm not falling for it this time. Hannah pouted dramatically, her lower lip sticking out like a child who had just been told they couldn't have a second dessert. Fine, she said, tossing the vial to the side and crossing her arms. But mark my words, Minu, this isn't the last time you'll be my test subject. I managed a small sigh of relief, but it was short-lived as she added, besides, if I can't experiment on you, I'll just have to find a new victim. Great, I said, rolling my eyes. I'm thrilled. Just then, she straightened up and adjusted her goggles again, as though the entire conversation had been a mild inconvenience. In that case, she said, maybe I'll work on some other ideas. You know, world domination can be a tricky business. I shuddered. For the love of all things sane, please take a break. Maybe get some snacks. You can't conquer the world on an empty stomach. She gave me a sideways glance. You're right. You're lucky I'm in a good mood after that incredibly successful experiment. But trust me, Minu, next time, you won't be able to escape. I was about to say something sarcastic, but instead, I just gave up. There was no point. Life with Hannah was a never-ending roller coaster, and the only thing I could do was hold on for dear life. The only question was, what kind of chaos would she dream up next? Story ends. Thanks for listening. See you again for another silly story.